All right, well, if you could find your seat, we are going to dive into part 2, traditional religion in America, as Alan and Sarah just told us that substantive database length has suffered huge losses for 3 decades. The number of Americans who identify as not religious has jumped from 5% in 1991 to 29% today. It really just is deafening. As we heard this morning, religious affiliation, service attendance, belief in God have all declined. More and more Americans claim to be spiritual but not religious. Revelations of sexual and financial scandals and cover-ups are surely part of the story, as public trust in organized religion broadly has declined significantly. The question is why? What happened starting in the early 1990s? Was it religious scandals? Was it the smartphone that didn't become ubiquitous until a dozen years ago? Why do so many young people pivot away from religion? Doesn't their stepping back mean that the future will be less and less religious? Well, Chris Smith's new book, which is 419 pages from Oxford Press, I think there's a real copy that may float around as well, is really a provocative tour de force that is going to sort of guide our conversation. He and Jason will both be talking about a lot of the themes in it, alongside sort of a deeper dive into the contemporary Black church and some fissures and movement there as well. But I really would heartily commend this book. As Chris says, it's a book not just about religious change, but also about culture. And Chris has spoken here twice, once to younger journalists, once when Mike Cromley was leading this forum. Thanks for coming back, Chris. Engaging Chris in conversation is Professor Jason Shelton. Jason E. Shelton from the University of Texas at Arlington, who's a gifted sociologist in his own right, who's published 2 books so far. Technically, I think compared with Chris's 21. So just keep going. That book.
I'm good. I'm not going to make it that far.
Okay. All right. But Jason's book, which we actually have a little card we're passing around as well, was featured by the Washington Post in the run-up to this last election cycle. And he argues, sort of like Chris, that the major departure in the Black community came from an institutional religion, came in the 1990s. That in that relatively tight-knit community with a shared history, this growing religious departure upended aspects of the moral core that address and can address in the future inequality and can help bridge the divide, racial divide in particular. So if that is in the Black community, if that's not coming from the church, where's it going to come from? Jason says that the AME and Black Baptists are sharply diminishing, while Black Pentecostals and non-denoms are holding steady, or in some cases even growing. But again, why? Why has religion gone obsolete? Chris Smith, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Josh. So I'm the why question. I'm going to pick up pretty much where Alan Cooperman left off and try to help lead us forward and think about some hopefully new ideas. I've spent the last 4 years basically working on trying to figure out the why answer, a good version of it, or what I hope is a good version, and writing it up. And now it's just finally coming out. It's not quite out, but I have my own hard copy. I'm going to pass it around so you can take a look at it.
Yes.
I started off, I just took for granted what Alan presented and what many of my other colleagues have been showing for a very long time, like American religion, America's not the exceptionalist case anymore that we used to think. It's really taken a dive. And I spend very little time in the book demonstrating that. I just quickly review. But I'm interested in understanding the how and why question, the causally explaining what produced this when it happened. And my general strategy is, I think the answer is in the realm of culture. So my general model is institutional changes, technological changes, world event changes transform things at a cultural level, and at that cultural level, traditional religion just didn't fit. It didn't vibe. It didn't really make sense. This is very generational. Alan already mentioned this, but I believe generations really matter. We could argue about the end and start dates, but I focus on millennials. My overall story is that boomers were one thing. They have their own story. Gen Xers were, in what I'm focused on, Gen Xers sort of unlocked the door and sort of opened the door. Millennials came along, pushed the door wide open, went through it, and started to do their own thing. And Gen Z, it appears, is sort of like carrying on, taking it to further extremes, mopping up, and so on. I think the time frame that matters in terms of causal explanation is 1991 to 20. This is going to sound way too specific and confident, but I'm naming it. 1991 is the crucial turning point year, and 2019 is sort of, we can call the end of the major changes.
What day in 1991?
I can answer that too. When Nirvana's Smells Like Teen Spirit went to #1.
Oh, wow. That was the fall.
That's being provocative. But 1990, a huge number of things happened in 1991 that matter for this. So I'm going to present this in 3 parts. First, I'm going to focus on the how and why. Then I want to talk about this concept of obsolescence and how it relates to the idea of decline, because they're similar but not identical. And then I want to end talking about the idea of cultural re-enchantment, which connects to Will's question about magic. So those are the 3 parts that are coming. First, the causal explanation. Most of this book is trying to explain how and why. I call it an historical cultural sociology. In the end, I say that there was a zeitgeist that developed starting in 91, the millennial zeitgeist. And it's not so much that millennials were like, I have philosophical problems with religion. It's just the era that developed culturally at a macro-cultural level. Traditional religion had serious mismatches with it. Cultural mismatches is a term that comes from sociology of education, where schools, their cultures, and teachers come from one way of thinking about the world. If you get students who come in from very different cultures, very different ethnicities, maybe first-generation college students, they suffer a lot in education, oftentimes not because they don't have the capacity to do the work, but there's just a cultural mismatch in expectations of how the world works and how you're supposed to present yourself and so on. So I think religion ended up the world changed around religion culturally and lots of other ways in a way that religion found itself just mismatched. It was just like obsolete in this new world. So that's where I'm going. I'm not going to take the time to spell out all of the forces or explain them. I'll spell out some of them, but I'm not going to explain them too much. But the main emphasis of the logic of my argument is something like this. The changes that matter were long-term. They have deep roots. It's not something that happened overnight. I identify 1991 as a pivot year, but there's a lot of momentum of stuff, of social forces at work heading up to that time that helped to explain what eventually happened. So long-term, highly complex. It's not just here are the three magic bullets that explain this. There's lots of complexity involved in all this. I argue that almost all the forces were unintended. So if you think about planned obsolescence in products and so on, this was not planned. Almost all the forces and developments and agents involved in this were not like, let's see how we can, flush religion down the toilet. They were concerned about other things. They were unintended consequences of what they were up to. So this is partly in contrast, I spell out in the book, conservative religious people have a tendency to think the world is against us. The secular humanists are our enemies, and they're actively. There's a little bit of that at work here, but that's really very small part of the larger story. Most of it is unintended obsolescence. Most of it is unrelated to religion per se as part of that. It's about demographic changes, technological changes, economic changes, geopolitical changes, wars, and academic theories, other things not directly about religion. My story also tries to situate it very much specifically in the American context. I'm not somebody who thinks these processes operate as social laws wherever they sort of descend in any society. It very much depends on a particular context, a particular history, particular cultural trajectory. So a lot of these, some of the forces like the digital revolution are global, but a number of them are quite local or quite nationally situated. Okay, so at the end, so some of these forces, I'll just run down a list here. Some of the longer term forces, deinstitutionalization of marriage and family. That's the sociological term for changes in the way people may have children or not. So not just divorce, but delayed marriage for people getting married or never getting married, cohabiting, delaying having children, et cetera, et cetera. That has huge, just that has huge consequences as a background or context for American religion, because most traditional religion is very much oriented toward the quote unquote traditional nuclear family. Women entering the paid workforce. I mean, this happened in the late 60s and through the 70s. So that transforms. All right, I said I'm not going to explain all the causal mechanisms, but that has a big consequence in terms of who's available to volunteer for whatever committees and so on and so on. Things we've already talked about here, long-term declining participation in face-to-face membership organizations, the triumph of mass consumerism, intensified expressive individualism, the rise of emerging adulthood, which I've talked about in other works, this idea that between being a teen and a fully settled down adult, the period of life that represents has stretched out very, very long now, so that people are sort of adults, sort of not really adults for a decade, and that changes people's experiences and their relationships with institutions and so on. Also because being religious is associated with being an adult for most teenagers. If you're not fully a settled down adult yet, then you're not really ready for religion. Maybe you'll do it sometime in the future, but it's not what you're supposed to be doing now. Then more recently, things like the rise of televangelism and the religious right. This is the Hout-Fisher thesis that I agree with. There's a huge backlash against that among certain sectors of Americans. The spread of Eastern religions and New Age movements. There's a whole story here about the parents of millennials, the 60s and 70s and the cultural revolutions there, and the intervening 1980s that was a supposed return to tradition and virtue, et cetera, et cetera. So I think there was a lot happening in the 60s and 70s that was the start of this. They got put on pause, basically, in the 80s, and then picked up again in 91 and sort of carried through. So it didn't sort of start whole cloth in the 90s. The parents mattered. But the parents grew up in a different era with different realities around them than their children did. So the children were able to carry things out in a way that their parents were not. Okay, lots of other things I'm not going to raise here, but what really mattered in the beginning of the 90s, I think, was the end of the Cold War, and America having to come to terms with what it was anymore and who it was, and we didn't have an enemy to unite us that was identified as atheistic, Marxist, Leninist, communists, and we were the believing, at least God-fearing nation. Not everybody believed, but as a national identity, we were God-fearing. That sort of evaporated, that went away quite quickly with the fall of the Berlin Wall and the disintegration of the Soviet Union. And we're still grappling now with, what is America? Like, does anything hold us together? Mm-hmm. Ascendant neoliberal capitalism in the 1990s and thereafter, and globalization, I think transformed both the conditions of work of younger people, what it took to be successful in the world, that made them less rooted, less what a traditional religion would expect of people, more mobile, more transient, and also changed the notion of what a good life is like, what a good human being is like. And I think neoliberalism did that. The digital revolution is probably the most important factor in all this, and in the book I spell out 9 or 10 distinct causal mechanisms by which the rise of the internet and everything else that's gone along with it sort of transformed people's use of time, people's attention, liquidating gatekeepers, changing underlying epistemologies of who do you trust? Like the internet, there are no gatekeepers in the internet like there used to be in a previous world with Walter Cronkite, et cetera. Pop postmodernism, I don't want to put too much on this, but I actually think it matters a lot. These French theories from the 60s float over the Atlantic. They land in the American humanities departments. They get taught to a whole generation and more of college students who don't really get the sophisticated parts of it, but they walk away believing, oh, okay, well, you can't trust authorities anymore, and we don't even know what authors really intended, and beyond every knowledge claim, there's a suspicion of a power grab, et cetera. I think really had an influence on the culture. Even other very simple millennial demographic mobility to cities. So millennials moved a lot, even more than boomers. And I run an analysis of where they moved from, where they moved to. Most of the places they moved to had less supply of religious organizations anyway, so there's just an ecological argument about where people end up and what they're able to connect with. And not to mention the fact that when you move, that's usually disruptive in terms of social networks and so on and so on. Other things like the rise of intensive parenting, what it meant to be a good parent during this era, placed much more burden on parents to constantly be scheduling things and developing all your kids' musical talents and sports talents, and et cetera, et cetera. In a way, I think detracted from religion. September 11 was a whole another huge matter that affected things. I think effectively it took the concept of religion, even though it was the bad Muslims who did it. I think eventually, culturally speaking, religion itself got tarnished, essentially polluted as related to violence and disorder and murder and so on. And that's related to the argument of the new atheists that came after September 11, where they sort of nailed these arguments down. They didn't really make much sense, in my opinion, or they were really problematic, but a lot of people were influenced by, wow, religion is that fundamental source of all the evil in the world. So the new atheism mattered. I argue that something like a third sexual revolution happened in this era, related to pornography, related to the digital revolution, in which young people's sense of what is normal sexually transformed in a way that they understood to be radically incompatible with what traditional religion taught. The mainstreaming of LGBTQ had a similar effect. Religious pluralism, there were lots of books. One at a Harvard Divinity School was especially important, arguing we're the most religiously pluralistic nation in the world. So this related to the question of what holds us together anymore. And there are behind all this, there's evidence to show, like survey evidence of what Americans talk about, answering questions like what's necessary to be a good American, and the religion part just slips down and down and down. Rise of identity politics, so people's sense of what are the core categories that define who I am. I think like being a Methodist, as we've already said, like that just sort of slipped way down the list, and other things became much more important. And as part of that, the sacralization of partisan politics. Like in some ways, politics itself took on certain characteristics of sacredness and like ultimacy that I think sort of sidelined religion. I make an argument that the war on terror, political polarization, global warming, and so on for millennials had this effect of creating a blanket of despair about the future that seemed to them incompatible with what traditional religion was all about. Changes in the economy, objectively, including the dot-com bubble burst and the 2008 meltdown for millennials, including my own kids, like their economic futures were compromised by globalization, neoliberalism, these other things. The idea that if I just work hard, get an education, I will be able to have this American dream. That really kind of fell apart, and what I argue is the traditional American dream is connected to traditional religion, and so there was sort of a general disengagement from investment. It's part of a general disengagement. We're talking about volunteering, et cetera, et cetera. Millennials had less and less of a stake in the future. And as part of that was the religious, feeling like they had a stake in a religious tradition. This whole movement around being good without God, all of this I document empirically. And then finally, on top of all that from the outside, within religion, all sorts of missteps and kind of shooting themselves in the head essentially happened. The sort of religion piled on all those things itself. So the biggest thing of those are religious scandals, of which there were gobs and gobs and gobs. The Catholic priest abuse scandal is just one, but in conservative Protestantism, in American Judaism, in fundamentalist Mormonism, like everywhere, every time you opened the newspaper or the television or whatever, there were more scandals. And that violated people's sense of what religion was supposed to be. And I say a lot more things about problems within evangelicalism particularly. In my view, with a decline in mainline Protestantism over the long term, even though evangelicals like to think of themselves as sort of the embattled minority and that we're on the outside. I think evangelicalism rose to the cultural position of this is the representative of a religion. Yeah. And so when evangelicalism screwed up X, Y, and Z, including televangelists, including failed campaigns like sexual purity campaigns and other things, that spoke to beyond evangelical boundaries. Okay, so that's the kind of logic of the argument that I have about the why. I use the language of perfect storms converging, so this almost seems overdetermined to me. So a perfect storm is like 3 or whatever storms that hit together at just the right time to create this superstorm. And it seems to me that from the point of view of traditional religion, this is like multiple perfect storms all coming together at the same time. By the time I got done writing this up, I thought, why would anybody be at all religious? Like, it's amazing to me that anyone still tries to be religious after all of these forces are at work. However, I don't just specify the causal mechanisms. Another piece of my argument is that I focus on the macro-cultural level, okay? I don't want to get into details about theory of culture, but I'm looking at sort of in the book I try to rehabilitate the concept of a zeitgeist. So a zeitgeist has a problematic intellectual history in Hegel and others, and so academics don't use it. It feels too like, tell me how to measure a spirit of an age, forget it. But I think zeitgeists are real. I think we know phenomenologically that they're real. I think we can sense them. And there's a scholar at London School of Economics, a cultural sociologist named Monica Krauss, who's written an article about rehabilitating the idea of zeitgeist. So that's what I try to do here. I think there was a millennial zeitgeist that for these 2 decades hit hard, an entire generation, and then they started to influence both sides on them. And again, as I said before, in that zeitgeist, religion just didn't make sense. It became obsolete. All right, so let me talk about obsolete. What it does and doesn't mean. Obsolete doesn't mean extinct. It doesn't mean extinguished. Or something, back up and say this. When we use the language of religious decline, that's familiar to us who do empirical surveys and such, because decline, it usually is focused on organizational characteristics like how many adherents does this denomination have? Or individual, like population studies. What percentage of the population believes this or practices that? So that's all fine and valuable. Everything I do is dependent upon that. But I think there are ways to understand what happened that are not simply reducible to decline. I think there's also what happened was obsolescence, and that's at a cultural level. And it's really hard to get, wow, it's amazing how fast time goes.
Take your time.
I'm going to take all the time that Alan took. So here's what I mean by obsolescence. Obsolete is when most people feel it's no longer useful or needed because something else has superseded it in function. It feels old-fashioned, it's been put out of business or style by some innovation, some larger trend, or perceived change in functional need. So we can think of lots of examples. The one I focus on in the book repeatedly is what desktop computers did to electric typewriters. I learned to type on electric typewriter. It worked perfectly well. I think there's a lot out there and they still work well, but they've been made obsolete. Like you're not rushing to your electric typewriter to write up your story today. Or automobiles and horse and buggies, or electronic calculators and slide rules and so on. These are different, or bell-bottom jeans from 72, where you wouldn't be caught dead in them by 1970, whatever. So this is what I mean by obsolescence. And this is hard to get at because we're talking about something fairly amorphous, a spirit, a sensibility, a vibe. Sociologists or social scientists would much rather have concrete, hard things we can measure. What I do to try to measure these things is jump into culture, like popular music and fashion styles and I do a lot of quasi-big data analysis of a huge corpus of media and the rise and fall of the reference to certain kinds of terms, and we're hundreds of keywords. So I can't go into those kind of details, but what obsolescence doesn't mean is useless or failed. Electric typewriters are still useful. There are some people that I'm no doubt still write on them. It just means something else has come along that makes it sort of feel left behind. Also, obsolescence doesn't mean totally abandoned or extinct, as I just said. Like I, for example, have lots of DVDs at home and CDs. Like you don't need them anymore. I don't feel like, but I still have them and I'll probably still play them someday. But they're obsolete. So which is to say, this may sound a little condescending to religious people. There's still religious people, like it's still happening. It's declined numerically, but it's not just that it's declined numerically, its cultural status has changed. Religion is now, so some of the words some of the concepts or analogies I use are, religion is now polluted in a way it wasn't before. It has a taint of pollution to it. The cultural mismatch, like it just doesn't connect up to most millennials' sense of what's real and what life is about, etc. The other thing about obsolescence is obsolete things depend upon for support in systems to be useful. You might say, I'm going to write with electric typewriter the rest of my life. Okay, well now you got to get the ribbon, and now if it breaks, you need to find someone to repair it, etc. Like it's not just this isolated thing. It's a social technology that requires support. Or email. Like if you're the only one on email in the world, it's not very useful to you. It requires more, there's the network effect is what we call this. Same thing singing in a choir. If you're the only one singing in a choir, there's two of you, it's not a very good choir experience. So the more religion declines, so to speak, the more culturally, it's harder to pull off that religion with this network effect and the need for sort of technical support. Okay, so that's I'll read some of the adjectives of what I consider to be the millennial zeitgeist. It's immanent. It's focused on this world, not the transcendent. It's individualistic. It's anti-institutional. There's a profound distrust of all institutions, which came up before. But there's a lot of people are not against the beliefs of religion, as we've seen. They probably believe some of it. They don't like the institutions. If it's institutional, it involves money and power, and that's bad, period. That's the end of the story. They don't want to be part. It's presentist. There's not a sense of history. There's not a sense of tradition. There's not a sense of the future. It's like what's happening now is what matters. It's relativist in multiple ways. It's distrustful. It's subjectivistic. Anti-authority, it's fluid, it's multicultural, it's minimalist. They strip away all unnecessary things, including creeds and tradition particularities. There's a transgressive dimension to the millennial zeitgeist. It's pornographic, it's jaded, it's consumeristic, it's entertained, it looks for stimulation, amusement, performance, spectacle, and it's re-enchanted, which is my next point. So that if you could take that in, or at least if you ever get to reading it, I'm trying to say that there's a certain feel, there's a certain sensibility. It has an aesthetic to it. It has an emotion to it. It's like what's in the air. Again, I know it's very hard to, you can't quantify it, but I still think it's real, in which traditional religious forms just didn't work or make sense or appeal. Okay.
You're doing awesome. Take your time.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Another dynamic here, in addition to mismatch and pollution, is crowding out. This is what economists talk about. Things sort of, well, I'm not going to explain economists, but religion was crowded out by a lot of other things, including what was considered to be necessary to be a good parent, and just in so many ways, religion was just crowded out. I'll just leave it at that. I talk about this in the book. What matters the most here, what I call, and sort of with James Hunter too, deep culture. So culture operates at different levels of depth. There's surface culture, it's kind of the froth on the surface, but there are these deep culture that many people aren't even reflective about. It's just so institutionalized, so obvious, so taken for granted. And these things take a long time to change, but what I'm saying is the deep culture underlying, transformed from, let's say, the Cold War era to the millennial zeitgeist, and the infrastructure of that deep culture did not sustain or support or make reasonable for most millennials doing traditional religion. Okay, by the way, I intentionally use the word traditional religion, not organized religion, because the thing I'm going to talk about next, which is the re-enchanted culture or a culture, is also organized. So I want to introduce this whole other sphere here. So enchantment, basically what I'm arguing at the end of this book, and I'm writing now a follow-up book to try to develop this out, is I believe that in American culture, a whole third major sort of sphere of play on the field, on the cultural field, sort of developed and grew significantly in a way that most of us, including myself until I did this, don't really see for fully what it is. We're sort of blind to it. So let me try to put it this way. The traditional, I believe, this is a little oversimplifying, but not too much. We've been trained, most of us, to believe that, to think in these, about all these issues in binary terms. There's religion and there's the secular. It's like a football game. There's a field, there's a line of gain, and the offense is trying to move it this way, and every yard that offense wins, the defense loses. So it's this push back and forth. What I'm saying is that's true, but on this field, in the 90s and 2000s and after, a whole group of people sort of came down out of the stands and started to play their own sport, which is neither team of the football game. And a lot of people, or some of the people that were playing football looked over and said, I want to play that sport instead. So they went over this way, which means it's not, so I'm sort of rejecting, I'm saying we need to get past the binary and see at least a third actor. It's probably more complicated than that. And the third thing that I'm talking about on the cultural field, I use the language of re-enchantment and a culture. Enchantment, the etymological roots of that have to do with to sing into being, to chant, to call forth. It's related to sensibilities of magic, to bringing things out that have a magical, mysterious, and it's related to power, exercising power in this world. A culture is a term I'm borrowing from British sociologists. It's not about cults, not about drinking Kool-Aid. The etymological origin of culture, of the occult, is hiddenness. And this was the old use of this. Things hidden, things concealed. And so what the occult was about is it had hidden knowledge. There's sort of a Gnostic sensibility in this world. There's also a conspiratorial sensibility in this world. So I'm talking about it. Here's a list of things that I think belong to this whole enchanted sphere of culture. Spirituality is a big part of it. Now, because we tend to think in terms of the traditional categories of American religion in this binary, we think, oh, spirituality, it's a new category that we should ask in our surveys, and it's like we should analyze it. Who is in that, et cetera, et cetera. I view spirituality as part of a much larger milieu of this re-enchanted culture. Alternative medicine, neo-paganism, magic, UFOs, a new age, not 1970s new age, a new age. Nature is sacred. It's fundamental transformations of views of what nature is and how humans should relate to nature is sacred. Ghost hauntings, body energies, magic, the paranormal, karma, laws of attraction, chakras, mindfulness, esoterica, crystals, herbalism, cosmic psychedelics, meditation, vampire undergrounds, reincarnation, herbalism, and so like this all. Now, I've spent my whole year discounting my whole career saying that stuff doesn't matter. I was always like, we study big things. We study major populations. We study important institutions. You want to study paganism? Whatever. Like, go write your book and get tenure, but it doesn't matter, basically. As was my attitude my whole career, I've really come around to see this stuff really matters. There's much more coherence in this. There's an underlying, I don't like the word worldview, but there's an underlying coherence in what's going on in all this that's attracting people. One of the reasons this matters, or let me read the first paragraph of the next book I'm writing on this, All right, here's a whole bunch of statements. There are more pagans, and this is all factually true. I have a whole page of footnotes. There are more pagans in the US today than Presbyterians. Americans who definitely, this is from surveys, believe that dead family members can communicate with them outnumber all US Catholics. 3 times metaphysical shops selling occult, magic, and New Age merchandise are open for business in the US than there are Christian bookstores. The market value of the US trade in healing crystals is greater than the entire US religious book industry. Of all English language books published since the year 2000 that sold 20 million or more copies, the majority are about wizards, magic, divine beings, and the laws of attraction. The number of copies of Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows that sold in the first 24 hours of its US release approached almost half of all US Bible sales that entire year. American adults who say they definitely believe in vampires, and they could have chosen maybe, but I'm not sure, this is the definites, who believe that vampires are actually real. The question was like, this is not metaphorical, you believe in vampires. Outnumber American Jews, Mormons, Muslims, and Jehovah's Witnesses combined. So there's something going on out there that's huge, and my thesis is this. We're so used to the categories of the old binary. No, here's my view. This alternative re-enchanted world of a culture is different from traditional religion. It doesn't play by the same rules. It's not structured the same way. It has different sensibilities. And if we look at it through the lens of how we're trained to look at traditional religion, we don't see much of it. And we discount it like, oh, that's just entertainment. People are weird, whatever. If we see it for its own terms, not imposing on it how we view traditional denominational religion, if we see it for its own terms, what it presents itself as, and it's not really all that big into presenting itself, but if we understand it in its own terms, we come to see there's something big going on here that's culturally significant. It's not just culturally, I mean, beyond cultural significance, it's also infiltrated the mainstream in various ways. So neoliberal capitalism, for example, has figured out how to use mindfulness to manage workers better and to like sort of work on coping and work, you know, so mindfulness, the entry of spirituality into the secular fields of mainstream medicine. There are various ways that this stuff has worked its way beyond just the circles of hardcore culture believers. So what I'm saying is, one of the conclusions of the book is, just because religion is losing does not mean that the secular is gaining. We used to think that. Every loss of religion would be a gain for secularism or atheism or the secular. Most of the people that are bailing out of religion are heading into this world of a culture. They can do it very casually or they could do it serious hardcore. They can choose a very light, happy version of this, or there's also a very dark side of a culture. So there's a lot of options. And it's not presented in the same way, like membership doesn't mean, like we have to retool the way we understand this to make sense of it. But a culture is where the growth is happening. I did a survey on this following the survey I did for this first book. By my analysis, about 12% of Americans are hardcore secularists. Many more are religious, and many more than that, and a good chunk are into a culture. There's also fascinatingly, like 12% of Americans who are totally into a culture by our measures and still do traditional religion. I've met some of these people. You know, they read A Course in Miracles. They still go to the Presbyterian Church, but they don't believe they don't want anything to do with sin, guilt, fear, whatever. They do something else. They just don't tell their pastor about it. Like they just filter in and out what they want to. So, which is to say the cultural field that we're all trying to make sense of, I think is more complicated, and we need new glasses or lenses by which to recognize for what it is. And I don't mean this in a fearful way, like the pagans are taking over. I don't at all. To me, it's fascinating to recognize this thing that's happening out there that doesn't fit the old categorical framework that including me, my whole career, have been used to working with. So There's more than that, but I'll stop there. Yeah.
Thank you, Chris. Jason, over to you.
All right. Well, thanks, Josh, for the invitation to be here today. Chris, I really enjoyed reading the book. I just got my hands on it about 4 or 5 days ago, y'all. So I've read the vast majority of it. It's 419 pages. It's great. The first 300, though, are really dedicated to this idea of religion becoming obsolete. And in the world that I live in terms of the sociology of religion, I think that Chris is really onto something with a contribution here. When you and I think about religion in America and the declines in religion, whether as academics or as journalists, we're sort of thinking the here and now in this moment, in the recent effects of people's lives over the last year or so. But what Chris is doing is he's taking a step back and taking a much longer view of American history that goes back really the last 50 years or so. And not only is he taking this bigger, longer view of our culture as a nation, but what he's also doing in the nerdy academic world is that he's not focusing again on this individual level. He's doing this more macro and institutional level. And that's not something that a lot of us as sociologists write on. We do deal with these theories and these ideas, but of course the story is what's happening right now among these people, not that bigger, broader story of the bigger why. We want the why did you leave your faith right now, not the bigger why of in a much broader context of what's happening in the United States of America. And I think Chris does that really, really well. I'm going to kind of stick with this idea of up here, because this is where he's writing. So think of our society and the individual level down here, and then there's sort of a middle ground of a cultural level or a sort of a meso level, and then there's this institutional level. And what he's saying is that the reason why religion is obsolete, despite all that we know about the election, right, from last year, and despite all that we know about people that we know and even people in this room who pray and go to church regularly, the reason why religion is obsolete in America in 2025 is because the framework was in action up here. So yeah, it's still moving. Religion is still moving on the ground level in everyday life. But up here, as it trickles down, you're just going to get more and more people at the individual level that are going to make religion obsolete. I told Chris, this semester I'm teaching my Religion in Modern America class. I should have taught it this morning, but I'm here with y'all. I let them go for today. And a few weeks in class, a few weeks ago in class, we discussed an article by a sociologist from Belgium named Karel Dabellieri. And he's got one of the few, I think, really great definitions of secularization that operates up here. I'm going to say the definition or his explanation for secularization, and then I'm going to fill in the gap for where Chris is coming in. So Dabellieri's definition of secularization is a process by which the overarching and transcendent religious system of old is being reduced in a modern, functionally differentiated society to a subsystem alongside other subsystems, losing in the process its overarching claims over other systems. So in essence, up here, religion was the overarching system and structure in society that gave form to business. Your religious practices and convictions are going to figure out and determine the way that you become a business person. It's going to figure out how you approach teaching in a classroom. It's going to shape the way that you and I live our everyday lives, our careers, medicine, a whole bunch of different industries. Religion is going to take that precedent. But what Dabellieri is also saying is that with the passage of time, religion goes from being up here shaping all these other institutions to just being something that's right next to the other institutions, and you do it on Sunday, right? It becomes compartmentalized. It becomes something that is no more or less important than the other institutions that it's now alongside rather than structuring. Well, that definition has been around a while, and a lot of sociology professors like myself use it when we're teaching. But what Chris does in this book is he breaks down the details of how religion in America went from here to just one of those other institutions. And that's what I think he's doing here that's incredibly powerful, that a lot of us are going to read and latch onto. So when he talks about higher education for the masses, and the effect of that after World War II, and the long run impact that that's going to have in society. That's not something that we as sociologists have been sitting around writing about when we talk about the decline of religion in America. Or, of course, we have talked about women entering the paid workforce, right? The consequences of that. But there are a whole host of things. Not too many of us as sociologists have talked about the triumph of consumerism, and the role that that would play, the march of capitalism in modern day material America, and how it's going to affect this long run game. He's basically giving us the big picture of all these ingredients in the pot, that most of which, as he said, are indirectly related to religion in America, but would come to directly impact you and I and the people that we love and how we think about and practice religion. So I think that's really those first 300 pages where Chris breaks that down, I think is a tremendous contribution to our understanding that's going to carry the field for a good ways. He's going to run into some trouble with measuring some of these things, right? As he said too before, that how we measure some of this. But I think he's exactly right when you talk about the zeitgeist. In 1991, I turned 16 in 1992. So I was reading this like, okay, and as you go down the list and you can talk about Nirvana and Smells Like Teen Spirit, that was the fall, because we were watching MTV, and when you talked about just how American culture changed dramatically, I think you're exactly right about the optimism of the 1990s. I can speak to that as an African-American kid during those days. Good Lord, those were the good days of the Clinton administration and movement in the black middle class and moving to the suburbs, and life was grand. There was a tremendous optimism that you tapped into for that last decade of the 20th century. And then you make the turn to 2001, living right here in this city in Miami for grad school, and 9/11 happens, and all of the optimism is gone. And the gloom and doom that you wrote about in the turn, I think it was exactly right. And it's difficult to measure, but I think you're exactly right. And the accumulation of all of these major changes that would happen in prior decades that come into fruition and its consequences in the 90s. So I think you're exactly right there. The digital revolution, the rise of the LGBTQ community, multicultural education in the United States. Man, it was so funny. I didn't know if I was going to say this, but I'm going to say it. When the legendary sociologist Chris Smith writes the word booty call in the book, I know that American society and culture has changed and has gotten his attention, because the flow of hip hop getting the nation's attention to pay attention and using these words and how we describe that third wave of sexuality in the United States, he nailed it and he got it. And so I'm with you 1,000% on that. As I read through the book, though, I also had a couple of quick questions. I don't know if we should do this now or we do it later. And these are all pretty soft gimmies, Chris. He lists a number of really important things in society that were, that on this macro sociological level that changed the game. One of them that you didn't, I was trying to sit up here and think, like, what didn't he say? What didn't he say? And one of the things that got me was, and you hint at, of course, technology, not hint, you go deep on the technology and the march of modernity, but one of the more specific things I thought was like NASA and the space race. And particularly for me as a kid, Ohio is home, but I was a little kid in Los Angeles. I remember the Challenger explosion, watching it at school. And I remember discussions about Sunday school and God created the world in 6 days and rested on the seventh, but there's nothing about outer space, right? There's nothing about what's beyond this planet. And I remember going home talking to Mom after that day, after watching the Challenger explode, and the conversations that we would have about, well, Mom, they were going to space, right? Well, she said something to the effect of, because my mom's a pastor, something to the effect of, the Lord is going to bless them and they're going to do their thing and all this good stuff. And I'm like, they didn't really do their thing, Ma. Like what's really going on here? And she had these, but she couldn't explain it, but that opened the door to another world, literally. Science fiction movies, all of this stuff. There's nothing about religion. For us as a generation, those science fiction movies and space opened a new world and a new frontier that was beyond the realm of religion. And I was curious to know if that had some impact in your thinking in some way. Another question I would love to ask you is that, of course, religion is obsolete at this larger macro level. And I'd imagine that per Alan's point, I enjoyed your presentation earlier too, fast forward the clock, we all know that the young people that are going to be sitting in this room 50, 100 years from now, they're going to see religion a whole lot differently than we do. But my question for you was, when is the next jump in the nuns going to come, and how high does it go? Right? As those believers, as those current believers that are still here, yeah, we've leveled out for now, forgive me, Alan, but as we move forward and the next jump happens, what happens then? This is a great conversation that I have with my students at the university, and I frame it as how low do we go? But you get it, how high do we go, or how low does Christianity go in the United States of America? How low does official religious affiliation in the United States go? And how high do the nuns go? Because I'd love to ask you that. If you fast forward the clock 100 years from now, what do the numbers look like in the nerdy word of rel-trad, right? How many evangelicals are there? How many mainline Protestants are there? How many nuns are there? I'd love to hear your thoughts about that. And then the last one, sir, was here we are, I thought just so ironic, here we are talking to Chris Smith, legendary sociologist who wrote a great book that's on my bookshelf back in Texas about American evangelicals embattled and thriving, right? Embattled and thriving in the late 1990s. And I'm sure you'd say they're embattled, but I'd imagine you would also say they're not thriving in today's world. But here would be the question: how do you explain your broader argument about religion's decline at a time when most Americans see evangelicals with more power in their local communities, state governments, and the federal government than they have ever had before? How do you explain this book, this broader argument that we as sociologists get who study secularization? How do you nail that down for people who are just everyday Americans and aren't really paying attention or understand that broader secularization point?
Mm-hmm. Okay. Thank you. Well, I'm going to pull a classically, sociologically anti-humanistic move here. Ordinary people don't matter. I mean, they follow up along the lines of the forces that drive them. What matter are institutions and these big picture social changes that I'll pull up. So that's the strong version. On the embattled and thriving piece, what I argue there is that evangelicals, a lot of this is constructed in their minds and in their subculture as embattled and thriving. And I think they see themselves as more embattled than ever. Mm-hmm. And the right-wing paranoid part of evangelicalism has taken over and sort of marginalized the moderates that used to be more in charge. So if you think about Christian nationalism and the evangelical role in that, I mean, to me, I'm not trying to fit all the square pegs into the round holes of my book, but to me, Christian nationalism is a symptom of obsolescence. It's a greater desperation of the position of evangelicalism in the larger world, so that it used to be the Christian right said, we need godly people in power to save America for God. And that's gone. Like the person who they're looking to now to save their asses is the least godly person you could imagine. So it's really been, so Christian nationalism I don't view as a contradiction of obsolescence. I view it as a symptom of a certain sector, of a certain subculture that has a greater sense of desperation, that is more out to protect and defend itself than the traditional evangelical mission of saving souls and shaping the culture. I don't know if that really answers that question. I wrote that book out of data that came from the mid-90s, and so the world has changed tremendously. I still think the underlying causal dynamics of subcultures being able to form strong identities by creating symbolic boundaries between them and threats, and that there has to be the right mixture of that, still holds and probably can apply to other traditions, but American evangelicalism itself has morphed in weird directions, I think. So I'm not sure, I haven't thought about that book in a long time, and I'm not sure how I think about that. The middle question about what comes next, or the jump in the nuns. I mean, first of all, my view of the recent landscape study is, I believe that there's a flattening trend line, but I mean, we've always all known that it could never continue indefinitely. At some point, you run out of people who are going to become not religious. So the question is where and when that will happen. And secondly, I think everyone, Alan, Mark, and everyone else would agree, we need more time to really see, is this a temporary pause that will continue, or is this going to turn around? Like I said, it's a really interesting, intriguing data point at this point, but where it's going to go, I don't know. I really am very historically focused and not guessing much about the future. Every time you think you know where things are going, things come up that nobody ever expected. Yogi Berra once said, prediction is really hard, especially about the future. So, and that's I don't try to predict, because you're just setting yourself up to be shown to have been wrong, which none of us like. So, my sense is that religion is still culturally obsolete. The millennial zeitgeist still sort of dominates the macro-cultural frame of things. Gen Z is not fundamentally transforming it. All the Gen Zers I know we read or talk to about this stuff, they're like, yeah, that's it. It's only more intense for us now. So, but that's not to say it'll last forever. I mean, every zeitgeist is a period of time, and then something else comes along. What will change it or not, I don't know. The main focus of my book is trying to explain something we already know about, something that's happened. It's interesting to speculate about the future. I personally, there are some hopeful people that I consider wishful thinking, we're on the cusp of a revival, or things will get so bad that people will return to God, or so. Maybe, but I don't see that in the cards. I mean, it goes back to the deep culture argument. You don't just turn a ocean liner on a dime. You don't turn deep culture like that. There are always movements of people, maybe young men are now returning to church or something, but that's froth on the surface compared to the deep, long driving forces. So it will take, to really make a fundamental change, in my guess, is it would take transformations in technology, which may be around the corner, transformations in technology, geopolitics, the economy, et cetera, along the order of the things that I bring in, like the digital revolution, the war on terror, et cetera. So, but where it's going, I don't know. I wait for Ellen to report that to us in coming. As far as your first question about space, I really don't have any thoughts about the NASA version of going into outer space. Science fiction actually plays a very important role in a culture. Science fiction grows, has its flourishing actually in the 50s with Sputnik and all the race, and it has a Cold War element to it. So there are these markers along the way that lead to the flourishing of a culture now. I would say early ones are science fiction in the 50s. Twilight Zone in 1958 is a huge, opening of the door more. Then The Exorcist, and then, by the time we come along to our era, Twin Peaks. If you haven't watched Twin Peaks, that's about as weird as, it gets. X-Files, Buffy, all this stuff they're entertaining, they're engaging, they weird you out, et cetera, but they're not just entertainment. So there are these markers. There are book published that are very important. There are movies. Harry Potter is obviously huge in this. But, so I guess what I'm backing up and saying, science fiction is an important piece of this. One of the features of a culture is you can play with it. It's not about, I believe this doctor. It's about, you can play with it. Maybe I believe this, maybe I don't. Maybe I sort of do. Maybe I'll talk myself into. Maybe we'll have a role play game weekend where we do Dungeons and Dragons and you play the Dracula or whatever. Like, so it's easier to move in and out and through of a cultural than like, are you in a membership class for your Episcopal church? So again, that's the theme of we have to see it differently to see it. Okay. Those are some initial.
No, very good. I appreciate that.
I do think something changed when we went to the moon and took pictures of our planet.
Yes.
For sure.
Yeah.
Like that had a huge environmental consciousness in, but I'm not sure how to fit that into the religious part. Yeah.
Oh, very good. I appreciate those. I just, as I read through the book, I remember thinking about particularly that Challenger thing. That was deep. And then as the years went by, I remember one day sitting around watching, late 80s movies like Predator and Aliens, and like, God didn't create aliens. Kids sitting around talking mess, right? And like philosophical conversations about that. And that was for us a big beginning. So with
Challenger was a huge thing for Gen Xers.
Yeah, it was.
But then along comes in younger people and they don't really know what you're talking about. So.
Oh yeah. So with that, I'll take a few minutes to kind of talk about my book. It came out in August of 2024. On the sort of the run-up to the presidential election. And you guys got the little book card there, The Contemporary Black Church. This was essentially the book that I wanted to write. I told you all that I was a kid in Los Angeles, and my parents were always of the Black Methodist tradition. And we started, the first church I ever remember going to was a Methodist church. And then we moved to West Angeles Church of God in Christ, which is the THE big and most conservative church in LA. But what was also interesting, and this is in the Black community, my dad worked in the music industry. So, he worked with all these rappers back in the day. And so he lived this entertainment life, but then on Sunday we'd be in church. And it just kind of seemed like, wow, this is interesting. Like over here, Monday through Friday is kind of cussing and talking mess in public with entertainment. But then on Sunday, this is evangelical Christianity. And not only that, I remember the difference between going to Holman United Methodist Church in LA, which was, Black Methodist Church, which was very different than walking in and watching people speak in tongues and dancing down the aisle at West Angeles. And then fast forward the clock when I get to graduate school and I start learning about religion. I didn't study religion first and foremost, y'all. I started studying African-American culture and politics. Religion came to me kind of after the fact. Because you can't study African-American religion, you can't study African-American middle class and politics without getting to religion. And so I kind of got there through the back door. Anyway, there's this kind of monolithic view of Black America, and what is the Black church? And in my walk in life, I knew Black folks who grew up in the church, who left the church. I knew Black folks who grew up in the church and stayed in the church. I knew Black folks who grew up in the church and went on to do a whole lot of other things that had nothing to do with religion. And that's essentially what my book is about. When I originally wrote it, it was called Religious Diversity Among African Americans. And if you buy the book and you read the book and you start realizing, I use that term throughout the book. And then NYU Press was like, nope, we're going to rename this bad boy. We're going to call this the Contemporary Black Church. And I was like, you know what? I'm good with that. Let's do it. But in essence, what I'm doing reinforces a lot of what Chris is doing. There are some major macro sociological changes that are happening in the United States of America. I would argue that a lot of the things that Chris is writing about, yes, they affected people like me. I'm a Gen Xer and I was in the middle class as a Black kid in LA. right? So I remember, so yes, I've never felt like I wasn't a part of the American mainstream. I watched MTV. I was a part, I had white friends. I understood that. But I would also say there's a legacy of discrimination and inequality in there for a lot of poor Black folks, that they never got some of these structural transformations and some of these things that would filter down to the neighborhood level in Black communities across the US. That being said, by the time we get to the 1990s, that's when it would become very clear. And the data in my book shows that, so for white baby boomers, they were leaving by the 70s. And there's evidence of that very clearly. But for Black folks, we were sticking with the church, right? The church was it was the good Lord that brought us this far. So how dare me not go to church, right? That's what we were always taught. And that's what we were always emphasized. You better go to church. It's the good Lord. But by the time we get to 1992, and I'm sitting in the back of the church writing rhymes, right? And I'm reading the Source magazine, which is essentially the Bible for hip hop culture, and I wasn't the only one back there. And that was where a lot of that sort of larger transformations we began to see in Black America begin to impact us. It's to the point now that Black nuns are now the second largest religious affiliation in Black America. The Baptists are still the largest, but they've lost tons of people. And you wouldn't know it because they're still the largest group. But Black folks who are Baptists comprise about 60% of Black America for the longest time. So now they're around 40%. They're still a majority. But so we don't see that the same way unless you're Baptist. I'm not Baptist, but you go to a Baptist church, the folks who've been in those churches for years will tell you how many empty pews there are now, right? They see it clearly. I can tell you as a Methodist, in the early 1970s, Black Methodists were 20% of the Black population. We're down to 5% now. And when I ran that same data analysis on just millennials, they're down to 3%. So a lot of the Black Methodist tradition has said, Jason, thank you for raising the red flag, because we're just about dead. Like, we're at our end. We're pretty much obsolete. And that's one of the things I wanted to do, was I wanted people to see that the Black Methodist tradition, the AME Church, is the first historic Black denomination in the United States of America, and we're pretty much on our deathbed, right? And so the idea here is that there's fundamental change in Black America, but I also argue, and I know I just got a minute or two left, is that these changes are far more consequential for Black folks than they are for the broader American public. And that, I argue, is because of the legacy of racial discrimination and inequality. Black folks are still overrepresented in poverty in the United States of America. And it has been the church that has been that source of community. Per a question earlier this morning, someone was asking about the connection between church and community engagement. I show you in my book very clearly that it's the Black churchgoers that are the people who are far more likely to be involved in community groups. They're far more likely to be involved in fraternal organizations, far more likely to be involved in gardening clubs, in book clubs, and professional societies. That involvement in the church, as one of the preachers that I interviewed talked about, is that the church is the lifeline to other sources of community. So if the church falls apart and falls to the wayside, and it's very clear that that's happening, and it's very clear that a growing number of nuns are not even involved in the Black community, then who is it that's going to fight this battle for those Black folks who are overrepresented in poverty in today's world? I make the case that the future doesn't look good for Black America and contemporary inequality. And I ultimately make the case that a word in sociology that we really aren't supposed to use is assimilation. And the argument is that Black folks have experienced so much racism and so much discrimination that assimilation does not apply to us. Well, I argue in this book that's not true, because I make it very clear and I show you that the fastest growing Protestant tradition in Black America are Black non-denoms. They have grown exponentially over the last few decades, as they have in America overall. But a big difference is that these are Black folks who are very well-to-do, and they're twice as likely to vote for Republican presidential candidates, and they're far less likely to live in Black communities. So if the fastest growing tradition in the church is less engaged politically and in the Black community, what does that mean in the future as more and more Black folks leave organized religion and those traditional Black denominations, the Baptists, the Methodists, and the Pentecostals, are dying and losing people left and right? So my book is sort of the red flag to say, y'all, we in trouble. And thankfully, some folks have paid some attention to it. And I'm done, so thank you.
Thank you both very much. It's great. All right, so we got a lot of questions. Hey. Thank you. Mark Chavez, let's start with you. Another sociologist referenced.
Chris, thanks a lot. Clearly a major work. A lot of it has to be true.
Hit that mic if you wouldn't mind.
Oh, I just hit it once. I don't have to hold the button. Sorry. Okay, 3 questions. The first one is, I'm going to say it as a claim that I think is in tension with your main story, but so you'll tell me why the claim's wrong. And the claim is that the shift to obsolescence is way longer term than the 1990s culmination, or the cohort differences started as far back as we can see in the survey data. The people born in 1930 are less religious than the people born in 1920, and so on. And so, especially in Europe, I know yours is an American story, but I'm nervous about how do you square what looks to me like longer term change with the main claim that 1990, it's all okay. So that's one. Second is the new thing, the new zeitgeist that that, as you know, because
Reenchantment.
The reenchantment. As you know, my view is what yours has been since a year ago. It sounds like, and so I look forward to trying to be convinced that it's wrong. Is that this is not socially significant, basically, this new stuff. And I didn't hear you say anything that would make me think otherwise. There's probably, there's way more in the book, obviously, than you said, but like that first paragraph of your new book is a lot of numbers, but none of that sounded like social significance to me. Because of course, numbers don't add up to social significance in this realm. So can you say more about convince me that this stuff is social significant? And third is kind of related to that is the 1970s sociologists of religion in the 1970s were calling attention to the consciousness reformation and New Age religion of there and saying exactly, I think, things you're saying about the Bob Wuthnow, I think his first book was The Consciousness Reformation. Yeah. And I think the first paragraph of that sounds a lot like things you said. We're in the middle of a major transformation in this new stuff. And
which I always, don't tell Bob I said this, but I always thought, that's a ridiculous book.
Right, so tell me why we shouldn't think that about they were wrong. We know that now, but it's so
wrong.
Similar. They were wrong about the
whole Aquarian age transformation.
Right. They were wrong that what they saw as this merging new zeitgeist, in their view, was going to be important in the future of religion and so on. So, yours sounds like a lot like that, and so why should I be less skeptical of this? Because there's this. I'm nervous about just on the reading. I've read the book on your hearing. I'm nervous about the presentist. It's historical, but not that far back, and and it explanations that make the world, the sky fall in our lifetimes. Make it over.
Great questions. Let's see if I can try to answer them here. I mean, I totally agree with you that the long-term dynamics, that there are long-term trends, let's say, of longer-term trends of decline. I don't have any problem with that whatsoever. I guess what I would say, though, is, again, there's a difference between measuring organizational numbers and the feel of a culture and how a culture strikes people, how a zeitgeist works. So there's a whole chapter in this book where I lay out a bunch of metaphors that I think help us to understand the timing of some of these. And one of them is a very simple idea of tipping points. Like things can go for a long time in a certain direction and the fundamental structure remains the same, but you hit a certain quantitative point and then qualitatively things change dramatically. Okay, that's one. I have other like avalanche science and other metaphors that I think help us make sense of this. So I think what happened was, all those trends were in play for a very long time. And I actually say, look, if we really want to explain this, we have to go back. I mean, I use Peter Berger. We have to go back to the invention of monotheism. My book is not going to do that, though. And the Protestant Reformation, like there's so many. So the question is, how far back? What is the proximate time? I do think that there were qualitative changes as a result of the accumulation of some of the quantitative changes that hit in the early 90s. The other thing I would say is, at a cultural level, even though there's sort of linear trends that we can trace over time, there were other events in the world that sort of got in the way, like, for example, the Cold War. All right, so there's a really interesting book out called The Spiritual Industrial Complex. So there's a history now that's emerging about how the Pentagon and Eisenhower and Billy Graham was in all, like, it's not conspiratorial, but sort of actively, intentionally mobilized so that the post-war boom in religion wasn't just this spontaneous, let's take our kids to church. There was an effort to draw the Americans together that clergy and whatever played a role in. And so when you have a national situation in the Cold War against the godless atheists, and you have politicians and religious people working together, that can strengthen or appear to strengthen things in terms of the religion's position in society, that when the Cold War is over, that kind of falls apart. I also, as I said before, I think the 1980s was something of like a pause for very particular reasons. But then after the Reagan era, again, think about zeitgeist, like the Reagan era was a Reagan era. This is long gone. It's just a whole nother world. So I guess I would say that there are social mechanisms whereby quantitative accumulations kick into new qualitative situations. The second thing is enchanted, not socially significant. So I'll give the philosophical response. Well, it all depends on what you mean by socially significant. A lot of people say, follow the money. If people are spending all this money, that's socially significant. Well, I just showed they're spending tons of money, so that's not socially significant. So I guess I want to know, what do you mean by socially significant?
I would say that they're building institutions that are having consequences in the locally, nationally, but mainly institution building that people are in.
Huge infrastructure of institution building. It just looks differently. It's put together differently than what we expect an institution to look like. And I think the consequences are still, I know this is a bit of a promissory note, but I think the consequences are still playing out. But I think underneath it is really a sea change in understanding of cosmology, of what human life is about, of like what the relation of the human mind, what it means to be a moral person, that will ramify in coming years and decades. I think we've already started to see some of that. I think if I were a hardcore secularist, I would say there are big consequences of a culture because they're not coming to my side. Most of the people exiting or peeling off of religion are not coming to me. They're doing some other crazy shit. So, I guess we have to get down to what we think counts and what's going to matter to us, that this is a significant thing. So there's also a brand new book out called The Shape of Spirituality, which tries to argue, I've only read some of it and it's not totally convincing, but there are people trying to argue that even spirituality has socially significant ramifications. So I'm with you in the assumption, like, what makes something matter? We need to see this, but I'm pretty well convinced that it does. 1970s consciousness reformation. The age of Aquarius didn't happen in the sense of, and Bob was in Berkeley, and Rod Stark told me some things. Well, I shouldn't go there, but
This part's off the record.
I'm not making a claim that there is going to be a consciousness reformation. I'm making a claim that American culture is being morphed, like the field of play is being morphed around by people developing things and that they are getting expressions. Capitalists are making a lot of money off of this stuff. Media is capitalizing on this stuff left and right. It's all over the place. And it matters not in terms of will the world really change, but it matters in terms of how people, now I'm contradicting individuals don't matter, it matters how people and communities understand themselves, where they want to locate themselves vis-a-vis some institutions like the church or et cetera. And that is really happening. And that gets back to the significance, and so does it matter. But it's a major thing. We just need the tools and the lenses to see it through. I had one other thought about 70. Oh yeah, I've already said it, which is I think a lot of the groundwork for the recent flourishing of enchantment was laid in the 60s and 70s. Tons of it was. And again, it just sort of went underground. Once you start studying this history, all this stuff, esoterica, metaphysical, new thought, has been through in America from the start. It's just been more or less suppressed or allowed to be. So there's a lot of historians write about this. This is not new stuff. This has been around. So for me, it's not a matter of this is a suddenly new thing. It's that this is like a subterranean part of American culture that arises and then comes back in waves. So I think we're in a wave now that the 1970s was a last version of. But I think the conditions now are different than then with the internet. The internet makes the spread of this stuff immeasurably easier. Finding other people who believe what you believe, et cetera. So yeah, I think it's a different social context that makes it more plausible and flourishing. So we'll see. I had one more thought, but I've forgotten it.
All right, that's good, because we got to keep this puppy moving. So, okay, the only rules from now on are you got 3 sociologists in the room, no triple questions from sociologists to sociologists, all right, because that just takes a long time. We've got 11 questions on deck. Here's my suggestion. In the agenda that you have in your program, which of course has lots of great biographical information about all of our speakers, all of our fellow peer journalists. It says that we're going to start this session at 1 p.m., that the next thing is 6 p.m. a reception, okay? We're not going all the way to dinner. We're going to stop this conversation. We're going to aim for about 3:45, and my suggestion is that we do not take a break. We just push to 3:45, then you get a real break to go file stories, to go to the beach, et cetera, okay? So we got 11 questions on deck. Andrew Egger from the Bulwark.
Is this thing on? Oh, it's on. Thank you both. That was super interesting, super informative. I hope you will permit me to ask a question about our current political moment, which is that I do think that one way of looking at the Trump phenomenon, one thing you hear a lot is about sort of the emergence and the triumph of the political new religious right, the Christian nationalists in the coalition and things like that. That's a big part of the narrative. But also, I mean, as I was hearing you talk about re-enchantment and culture, I mean, it seems like there's a gigantic dollop of that in kind of the Trump coalition now that wasn't necessarily so obviously around before. It was around some, but I mean, you look at Joe Rogan and Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and anti-vaxxers and QAnon and chemtrail conspiracy theorists and all those sorts of things that I mean, really resonate with what I was hearing you say about just in terms of the things that are hidden and in particular, I don't know if this is a subset or if it's just inherent to the phenomenon you're talking about, but the things that have been hidden from you by some ominous force and that the political energy is to uncover and to bring to light. I mean, the Jeffrey Epstein files or the JFK files, there's a huge amount of that kind of energy there as well, and so. I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about the way that, yes, like these are two of kind of, as you described them, they're not oppositional forces, but they're definitely two very different forces, but that now seemingly have like at the least a political alliance in some way that I don't really understand happening right now.
That's a really interesting. So I wouldn't use the word alliance. First of all, ever since the election, I can't watch the news. So I'm not paying close attention to Trumpism because I just can't stomach it. So, but having said that, I'm admitting that I'm intentionally ignorant here now. But here's how I think about it. Let's think about orbits around masses, sun. So Trumpism is a kind of a big sun, and a culture is a kind of big sun. And there's things that orbit around, in those orbits. Now, that's probably a bad metaphor. What I'm trying to say is there's a set of things in the culture that can feed both into Trumpism, and they do feed into a culture. They're not the same things as, but they're sort of resources that can be drawn on. One is a conspiratorial culture, which again has another long history in the United States. But part of the hiddenness, a lot of a culture has this conspiratorial. And so when the CIA and the Pentagon say, we actually took UFOs seriously, see, we told you we knew, nobody ever listened. So that's, and also a reliance on, but a distrust of science is another piece of this, which shows up in Trumpism and COVID and vaccines, but also in the re-enchanted world. Like quantum physics shows that we're right. We crazy people are right, and just that the science is in the hands of these narrow-minded secular scientists. They just won't admit it. So I guess what I'm saying is it's not an alliance, that there are these dynamics that float around that can be drawn in. This is the orbiting part. That can be, parts of it can be drawn in or drawn on by different players in the field. And in this case, it would be Trumpism and a culture. I don't know if that really answers it, but.
Can I get on that?
This is part of what makes a culture different. There's no catechism. There's no seminary. It's much more, I call it it's not a pie chart, it's a cultural psychedelia. But that doesn't mean it's chaotic and empty.
So Andrew, I think that's a really interesting question. I'm sitting here, I was talking to a few folks maybe yesterday about the election, and in the run up to the election, a couple of buddies and I started calling our buddies, black males in particular, with all the conversation about how the brothers were going to vote in the election. And I talked to a few guys, and I called particularly my friends who didn't finish college. So I knew basically how most of my friends who were college graduates were going to vote. But I was kind of curious to talk about to the guys who went to college, didn't finish, never went to college. And for a couple of guys, there's that long conspiratorial strain in Black America. I remember, going as far back to the 90s, there's a conspiracy book called Behold a Pale Horse. That in the hip hop community, this was the New World Order. This is brain chips in your brain and all of that. The same dudes who loved that book back in the early 90s were the same ones who were talking about how Trump speaks the truth to the power, the hidden knowledge that's out there. This is anti-establishment. I'm not saying it's a bunch of guys, but I saw the similarity in the conspiracy theories in hip hop that were so strong back in those days. They came out that at least made some guys think twice. And it was clearly a theme in the hip hop community, particularly among the Gen Xers, who are now looked at as the old heads, who could talk to the young guys in hip hop about politics and maybe how they should vote. So I think it was there in that conspiratorial sense that did peel off, probably not a whole lot, but at least a few black males along the way.
Can we flip to Jer Fitzgerald from George Mason, who, by the way, has a really cool paper we're going to just plug tonight at dinner for 4 minutes.
Great. Thank you so much. Really enjoyed it. I really look forward to reading the book. So early on, you put a lot of weight on 1991 as a kind of critical juncture of sorts, and specifically the end of the Cold War. And as somebody who teaches class in international relations, I'm thinking of, first of all, you have Huntington's Clash of Civilizations, but you also have Fukuyama's End of History. And so the thesis of which being kind of liberalism is one, and it's defeated all the other isms. But he carves out caveats for religion and nationalism as two things that could potentially emerge to challenge liberalism. And so I'm just thinking then of kind of globally the rise of religious nationalism, right? And the kind of globalization of the culture wars, often kind of with the sort of exclusivist religious nationalism as part of the underlying structure of that. And things such as, Trump's Evangelical Council or Putin's kind of attachment to Patriarch Kirill, and then the US and Russia sort of seeming more close closely aligned in certain ways. So I'm wondering if you have any kind of comment on that or sort of how you view that. Whereas the superstructure domestically may be gone, but it's kind of globalized to some extent.
That's the sound of me not knowing what I'm going to say. I mean, one thing, this may not really answer your question, although when you said Fukuyama, it made me think of this, and Jason alluded to it, is that I say, within this one zeitgeist, I think it has two periods. The 90s were relatively light, optimistic, upbeat, promising, and I view the end of history as sort of an expression of that. Like, we won, like, the world's going to be great now, let's globalize, capitalism, democracy, etc. And then the 2000s turned into a whole other ballgame. It became much more bleak, dark, etc., with the war on terror especially, and some of the problematic aspects of globalization catching up. So, I don't really talk much in my analysis about globalization other than it as a feature of neoliberal capitalism and the effect of that big transformation on millennials as a generation, as workers, as people needing to make a living. So, which is to say, I have an account of a piece of it, but you're probably sort of thinking of something bigger than I've really given thought to yet.
Let's go next to Kathy Grossman.
Okay, you mentioned.
Hit that mic, though.
I have two things that surprised me, by the way, in this study, if you want me to talk about. Literally.
Next question. Oh.
Okay, there we go. You mentioned that there are, in fact, when you're talking to Mark, you mentioned that there are institutions being formed. We just don't recognize them as institutions. Can you give me some examples of that? I began thinking like we're looking at a Jackson Pollock painting, and it looks like lots of drips, but it's actually still a painting.
Yeah.
Give me a couple examples of the new institutions that we haven't recognized yet are institutions.
Well, maybe it's not that we recognize them, it's that we don't see them for what they are. But institutions, metaphysical stores all over the place. In my small town in Northwest Indiana, there are 0 Christian bookstores and 3 of those. Viable shops that serve a market as an institution. The institution of...
Metaphysical stores?
Yeah, metaphysical stores.
Yeah, but...
They sell crystals, they sell books,
Well, yeah, but I think of those as trends. I mean, I cover religion publishing.
A store isn't a trend, it's an institution.
Okay.
Okay, I'm going to be
I think of
contentious.
institutions bigger than that. But
Yeah, okay, so part of what makes a culture is its fluidity, and again, you say, well, if it's fluid, it doesn't matter, but it's its openness, its fluidity, but there are networks of people. It's organized more on a tribal level, networks of people who gather for workshops, who gather for trainings, who gather for healing, who gather on retreats. I went to a vampire ball in Chicago. It's this whole world of music, of rock and roll. It's not rock and roll, I don't know what it is. It's music that's vampire-ish, that's gothic, it's nationally known around the country. My son told me that his LA friends told him that, oh, Chicago is like the capital of the vampire underground. I'm like, what? I don't know anything about. So, okay.
all right.
Alternative healing, book publishing, magazines. This is not a huge thing, but Sunday morning I went to 2 services of Unity on the Bay. Just Google or Yelp Spiritual Miami or Spiritual Groups Miami. There's lots of groups. Unity on the Bay is a Unity Christianity group that it looks like an evangelical seeker church, but it's helping people get in touch with their the true divine selves. It's not about reform. It's not the Augustinian, you need to bend your will to God's will. It's about liberating your mind from all false. It's a changing of the mind. So I'm writing the book now. The end of this book is a promissory note. I promise you I will show this. In a year and a half, I will have but those are the kind of things I'm thinking of. But again, if we have a very specific idea of, here's the only kind of institution I think that matters, you'll miss it. because it's organized differently. It's networks, it's tribes, it's workshops, et cetera, which are truly out there. And are all the writers in Hollywood or wherever they write anymore, who write all the Netflix stories about avatars and ghosts and Bigfoot hunters and this is all over our entertainment. Is that an institution?
I guess I didn't have the same understanding of a definition, but now I understand how you see it.
Yeah.
How about Mara Gay?
Yeah, thanks. Just a question for Jason. You were talking about wealthier members of Black churches doing the impossible, which is assimilating into white America, essentially. Is that assimilation, or do you see it as accommodation to white supremacy and Christian nationalism? And what can be done to stop it? And also, I asked you this last night, but I'm going to ask you again because I think it's interesting, it's important, which is have you talked to these people in the past 6 weeks?
Oh, no, have not talked. Well, I live in Arlington, Texas, and I know a number of African Americans who are evangelicals and conservative Republicans. I've met more in Arlington than I met in my entire life. So I have talked to some, yes. And I know those handful that are pretty excited about some things. I know others who are upset about other things. But gosh. Okay, so there's a lot here. I argue that it's assimilation because it's not just, in my book, I look at a number of different things. For example, the General Social Survey is the data file that I analyze, and the GSS has some great questions about discrimination in the US. And you all know this, for the most part, African Americans are more likely to explain racial inequality on the basis of things like racism and inequality in the American educational system. There's 4 explanations. In other words, what causes racial discrimination in American society, or what causes racial inequality? One is clearly, you could say yes or no to racism. You could say yes or no to beliefs about inequality within the American educational system. In other words, that Black folks are more likely to go to bad schools and don't get a fair opportunity to get based on education. Another explanation is biological inferiority among African Americans. Thankfully, very few Americans answer yes to that today. The 4th option, though, is a lack of motivation. And what I show you in the book is that over the decades, African Americans, the number of Black folks who said yes to racism is steadily declining. The number of Black folks that say yes, Black folks go to bad schools, and that's a cause of the racial inequality, declining. The number of Black folks that say it's a lack of motivation, steadily increasing. And so here's where you put that together. You put together growing numbers of Black folks who who have white friends, growing numbers of African Americans who feel closer to whites than to African Americans. Here's one of those arguments that I think it needs to be made is that, and Christianity has always sort of been viewed as a melting pot. You can step into many Catholic parishes in Arlington and see the world. In St. Maria Goretti Catholic Church, a parish right in Arlington, good Lord, everybody under the sun is in there. It is a melting pot, and I think that's what we're beginning to see for some forms of Christianity. Is that white supremacy? Is that all of these other things? To be honest with you, I think that's where I think some of us on the academic left have said that's why I can't use words like assimilation. Because it's like in the old world of Black folks saying somebody hates themselves, right? Oh, you hate yourself. Those are Black folks that hate themselves. I never felt comfortable with those arguments in my classroom. I always felt like people are conscious of what they're doing for the most part. They're making these choices to align. And I just feel more comfortable with arguments about assimilation. I think that that's one of the things that we don't realize helps to explain why so many Latinos voted for President Trump. It's happening in America, but I think the academic left feels very uncomfortable with using that word because we want to emphasize diversity. But the reality is people are melting away, but they've been melting away. And this is part of it. People associate success in America with melting away and the consequences of the choices that we have to make along that way. So yeah, Mara, I'm very comfortable with using that word to explain it, and I think that it's in the long arc of American history, assimilation is alive and well. And two things can be true at the same time, by the way. Yes, Black folks can be experiencing lots of discrimination and admit it, but we can also say, yeah, I feel comfortable hanging out with these white folks more than I do with these Black folks.
Yeah, I know that we're short on time, but I just want to be clear that I wasn't necessarily talking about the idea of racial integration
Yes.
as assimilationist or accommodationist, but rather the phenomenon in which it seems like, if I'm understanding, some Black Americans, principally men, are voting for a Christian nationalist president. And we could have a whole forum on that. But I do think that is different. And so then the question is really, is the kind of pessimism that Chris was talking about maybe driving some of that?
Oh yeah, I could see that.
So that was kind of more the
most certainly so, and I could see that for African American males in particularly. Some of the things we kind of danced around with the conversation last night: longstanding joblessness among Black men, greater success among Black women, and the resentment that I know is that I feel among some of my homeboys. Definitely. So yeah, I think that a lot of that pessimism is in there. Yes.
Dan Silliman from Christianity Today.
Chris, I'm wondering if maybe I'm missing something in the story about the cultural forces driving the change. It's in the zeitgeist thesis, if I can call it that. Is there a cultural force or an explanation that's being ruled out? It feels a little bit to me like a yes, all of the above, right? It's the internet. It's also the end of the Cold War. It's also the sexual revolution. And so I'm just wondering, like, is there a force that people have talked about driving this that you can say it's not that?
Yeah. Okay, good question. First of all, my model is culture is the dependent variable, so to speak. So the forces driving are technological, economic, geopolitical, et cetera, and culture, the macro-cultural zeitgeist, is the result of all those forces. So, but what are the alternative hypotheses I'm rejecting? I'm not especially rejecting anything. I kind of am implicitly, but so I feel my goal is to make explicable something that we all know has happened, so everyone in the end can say, oh, now I understand why that's a totally reasonable outcome. Once you make something explicable, it seems like, well, yeah, but there's not a lot of explication of what were the causes of this. There's very little out there actually among scholars now. So, however, I would say my story is, it's not a rejection, but my story is a challenge to a few sort of models. One is that this is about secularization. Again, that's the binary. If religion loses, then the secular wins. And I'm saying secularization, I've said this my whole career, secularization theory is right. I mean, it's right, it's true, there's stuff going on, but not as this macro inevitable or not even, or quasi-inevitable sort of evolution in history. Secularization is a set of mechanisms that are at work in the social world, along with a lot of other mechanisms, some of which are anti-secularization. So what I'm saying, in this case, I'm saying the secular hasn't won from religion's loss. So that's one story of this. The other is, and there are two different views of this, the other is, I'm trying to be more particular in the story I tell. This is an American story, it's an American context. Jerry Falwell matters a lot in this story in a way that wouldn't show up in almost any other place. So I'm trying to bring it down from this sort of positivist laws of social life down to an actual historical account that is particular to its context. Now, some people would say, that's fine. You can tell the story up here, you can tell the story down here, they go together. Other people would say, or I might lean toward, if the story down here works this way, then the general theory story up here is much more complicated and problematic than most of us are willing to admit. So in a way, that's another way that traditional or received secularization theory, I'm not rejecting, but I'm saying, yeah, it's more complicated than that. The other implicit, what I am rejecting, I mean, I say this over and over in the book, is the view internal to more conservative religious traditions that this is happening because of intentional campaigns by anti-religious people. That's not, I mean, there were the new atheists, but that's a little piece of the story. And the religious scandals that happened inside religion were 20,000, hugely more damaging than what Richard Dawkins had to say. So, in other words, I'm not setting this up as like hypothesis testing. Here are 3 theories. Now I'll test it with data, and then this is the one that wins. I'm saying we all know something happened. We know the outcome. We haven't given enough attention to what brought that outcome about. I would like to. And that has consequences for understanding of how history and society work, the complexity, long-term, et cetera, et cetera. Does it make sense?
How about Kelsey Dallas?
I've had a strange obsession with the relationship between reality TV and religion recently, and wrote a bit in my newsletter about how you can see some of Pew's religion trends in this season of The Bachelor, the most recent Love is Blind. And I was curious if you write about reality TV as a force in your book, because I was delighted to see that the first season of The Real World aired in 1992. That's right at this timing.
No, I don't really write about reality TV. MTV would be much more important. And in some ways, reality TV comes in later. I'm sure it matters, but it didn't show up in my long list of possibility. I mean, there are other things I was aware I could unpack. For example, in this time period, science became aware that there were more species of hominins than we thought there were. And so to think about what in the world does creation and Adam and Eve mean if it's not just us and the Neanderthals, but there's also these people in Java and there's like that. But you could go on forever about, well, this added another 0.5% to the R square of the explanation. So reality TV may be important, but I hadn't thought about really too much about it. In any case, I don't write about it.
Still be a hook for a piece. Jack Jenkins.
Thank you both. And if either of y'all want to jump in on this, please do. I'm curious about, I think it's easy for a casual reader of this broader topic to kind of hear, what you're writing about in your book and hear, oh, okay, well, religion will just be like less influential on American society as a result, right? If there are fewer people who are religious, if there are fewer religious institutions, then like that means X plus Y means that we're just going to have to deal with it less. But that's, if the past 8 years have been any indication, that's not the case. And I'm curious about kind of the knock-on effects here, right? Like you mentioned, Christian nationalists, rallying behind Trump, and someone who doesn't necessarily even claim their tradition, and yet he was the person who handed conservative Christians a conservative Supreme Court that finally overturned Roe v. Wade, a decades-long initiative by the religious right. We now have an administration where the head of the Office of Management and Budget is a self-described Christian nationalist. The Secretary of Defense moved to Tennessee specifically to put his kids in a Christian school and attended church that was co-founded by a self-described Christian nationalist. And I give that context because it does the diminishment of religion's influence in our society potentially put a bunch of different religious groups in tension with each other or with society in a bigger way. And because our politics doesn't necessarily mean you to have 50% plus one, the way our primary system works is that primary voters can often be more impactful than general election voters. I mean, I know this is speculation, but what do you think, when you see that looking forward, how does that splintering end up impacting our politics and policies?
Jason, I'm looking at you.
I'm conflicted on some of this. On one end, in my racial and ethnic groups class, one of the books that I've used over the years talks about America as a Christian nation in the sense that immigrants came here to practice religion. Per Alan's point earlier, a great number of immigrants have always come to America to practice Christianity. In that sense, we're a Christian nation, right? I tell my students, and I've been doing this for years, long before Christian nationalism became a term. I tell my students, pull a dollar out of your pocket. One nation under God, So in that sense, I feel like these are themes that have been here ever since, and they've been politicized over the last 10 years especially. But on the other end, of course, we live at a time where, things are really hot politically, and religion is at the forefront of things in a way. A bigger part of me, though, thinks that what we're seeing in a lot of ways is the triumph of multiculturalism in a way like we would have never imagined. Yeah, I know your eyebrows raised. I saw that. In the sense that, and again, I'm an optimist. I have two daughters at home. I got to think big for them. But I also have to think that we've come so far that in my lifetime, I've never seen a step back. I think I was telling this to Mara last night. Somebody I was telling this to at our table, maybe. I'm 49 years old, and I had a great conversation with my father a few weeks ago, and we talk about his dad, Big Gene, we call him. And Big Gene would be laughing at us today because he thought, oh, you just thought it was over, huh? You never seen a step back in your life, Jason? Now you see it. Get ready to push forward. So I think we've come a long way, but I think we've made so much progress that finally the conservative right realized we can't do this the way we used to do this based on electing somebody who's actually one of us who believes what we believe. We got to do this a little bit differently to push back to make the gains that we want to make. And I think that sacrifice in the long run is going to do them in. But for right now, they're going to get the policies that they want. But I do think in the long arc, there's a sense of, I live in Arlington, Texas. My university is the 5th most racially and ethnically diverse university in the country in terms of student body population. All the colors of the rainbow are in my Black experience class. I remember teaching that class 25 years ago, and it'd be a bunch of Black kids. Now everybody's there. When I teach religion in modern America, everybody's there. It's won. Multiculturalism has won. But I think people have, some folks in our country, some conservatives, not all, have realized, hey, we got to make some decisions that maybe aren't the best for what we really want, but this sacrifice is doing in so many people, hence continued rise of the nuns. Give it time. It'll revert back to where a great moment. As director of African American Studies, I get to bring speakers. One of the great moments I ever had was picking up, at the time, Jim Clyburn was number 2 to Nancy Pelosi, and he was a speaker at our university, and the Center for African American Studies brought him, and I got to pick him up at the airport. He's in my car next to me. I'm picking him up at the airport, and I'm taking him to a local news channel to do a media interview, and we sat in Dallas traffic for an hour. So it was just me, Jim Clyburn, and he said something, he talked about the political pendulum in America going left and right. And so he talked about, this was after Donald Trump beat Hillary Clinton, and he just said, it's gonna go back to the left. We just gotta wait our time. And I just kind of thought, that's what my grandpa would say. 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Just gotta give it time. I was hesitant to jump in and answer that. That's what you saw on my face. But that's the optimism that is within me. And I think that's the optimism that my students need. Because my students are right now at a point in their lives where they feel like they've never seen pushback, but they've never lived long enough to see that you're going to get challenges and you're going to have to prepare to get your education to continue to move forward. And that's what I tell them. And they're excited, or I won't say excited, they are heartened by that, because I tell them you're in this classroom for a reason. Get the education that you need to prepare for your future to move forward, because it's going to be your turn to be at the front of the table one day to tell a room full of people. It's bad, but it's going to get better one day. And that's what I do.
Yeah, I mean, the question obviously is, what is the significance of Christian nationalism? Like, what sense should we make of it? How does it fit into this broader picture, if I understand what you're saying? And I guess my sense is Christian nationalism as a big political influence is not incompatible at all with traditional religion as a sort of a sector going obsolete, culturally speaking. I've already said I think it's a symptom of that. It would require more spelling out exactly how and why it works that way. But one has to do with religious effects. In other words, what I'm trying to deal with here is why would how do post-boomers view this institution, this hit tradition in our society, religion? And why is it that they're just incredibly less attracted to it, interested in identifying with it and practicing it? That to me is a question operating at a certain level that requires a certain kind of answer that's different from, well, what about the big influence of Christian nationalism? I don't really have an answer to that other than to say it feels a little apples and orangey-ish to me. My only optimism, well, I shouldn't go there. I mean, this thing about people dying, like in some ways you just need to let some generations die off, including my own, and things will be different. I can't predict the world, but if my model of Christian nationalism is not this growing thing that has this bright future in its own turn, it could, it could look really important now, and in 10 years we could turn into a totally fascist state. It's possible. But we could also look back and say, that was ridiculous.
Remember the Tea Party movement? Here today and gone.
I just want to clarify. I think part of what I'm asking is, if I'm hearing you right, it sounds like at least, more plausible than not is that this doesn't necessarily have staying power. My larger, structural analytical question is that, could you expect more things like this, whether it's Christian nationalism or some other kind of movement where precisely because religion is a diminishing cultural import, those who are affected by that or perceive that to be a negative trend are more likely to be strident politically? And since,
I think so. I mean, I think we could expect that. I'm not a history of religion scholar, but there's some literatures out there that show that when a culture or a subculture or a civilization is under threat or of like an existential threat, it does things religiously. There are religious revivals, cargo cults, ghost dance religions, et cetera, but they're not like the historic tradition, the historic received religious tradition. They're kind of, from the mainline point of view, it looks kind of weird, and they don't last very long. I really don't like to use this language, but I'll say they're more like spasms in the death throes, which is what scientists call near-death experience people who come back and say, I've seen heaven. Well, your brain was just spasming out, so don't worry about it. But
I agree. That's why I think it's near the end. I think
I could be totally wrong about that.
I think this is some last gasps of that's why I feel like multiculturalism is ultimately won in the long arc. As you argue in your book about mainline, the mainline has lost all the people today, but they won the war because their values have transcended throughout American society. I think the value of diversity in a great number of ways has transcended American society in a new generation of young people. But that new generation hasn't come of age completely yet. And their time is coming. And when it comes, we'll see it in a stronger way. But I think for their, Tea Party, QAnon, Christian nationalism, there'll be another one or two or few more after this. This is all part of it. But in the longer arc, I do believe that the values in that sense of the main line of openness and acceptance and freedom and yes, I'm going to add diversity to that as well, is deeply embedded enough in American society that the pushback had to be strong and fast to get people's attention.
Let me just say one more thing. One thing I will say about, if I'm right about a culture, I view that as a kind of a despair over public engagement. You can't change the world, so you should change your mind. And a turning inward. You get your tribe, you have your mind transformed, you discover your inner Christ, whatever it is, you heal yourself. But really there's a deep abandonment of the idea we could engage in collective action to change our world together. I think that's one of the meanings of a culture.
All right, so on this session, come for the retroactive sociology and big think looking back, but stick around for the future-minded, prophetic forecast. A little bit of both. All right, so let's do 2 more questions, and then we'll wrap. We'll wrap by 3:30. Okay, Alan Cooperman, you're up.
Okay, great.
And hit that mic.
Yep.
Good.
So first of all, just huge thanks, Chris. I haven't had a chance to read your book yet, but super looking forward to it. And the presentation by Jason and you, just very rich, and it's given me a million things to think about. And even some things I think might be measurable, though most of what you said is not. My question is a little bit piggybacking on Mark's question, and I guess I kind of want to know if we were to define socially significant as strongly correlated with pro-social behaviors, is a culture that? So what I'm trying to say is I've had this long discussion with Brian Steensland about whether spirituality, that's the term we've been using, is more like religion or is it more like gardening? Gardening is a good thing for you as an individual, but in a sort of big picture way, it's kind of just doing your own thing. And also kind of in the history of philosophy, and Candide again, that you're kind of going off and doing your own thing. Religion, one of the things that's so interesting to study about it is that it is correlated with all these other things that turn out to be good for you as an individual, but also good for society. And things like volunteering and voting, donating, and just being civically engaged. So I guess I'm wondering what your gut says about this whole sphere of a culture. Is it like religion in the sense that people who are in that and the institutions that it's building, as you said, are going to have that pro-social benefit? Or is it more like gardening, where it's a real thing, but it's not especially doing any healthy work for society as a whole? And I think this actually might be measurable. I haven't measured it. And I'd just be interested in your theorizing about, especially if it is helpful, if it is like healthy for society, how? What's the theory about why might we expect it to be actually a good thing in any way?
Yeah, I mean, I think the jury's still out on it, and I think there's variance within what I'm calling a culture. This congregation I went to, Unity on the Bay, they're very involved in Miami, raising money and helping be involved in the Pride Day, and they're very community engaged, but much of a culture is not. It's me and my future, my health. I consult with a psychic reader, or it depends on what you count as pro-social. If you count groups of people getting together once a month to do their thing together, does that generate social capital? Is it bridging? Is it just bonding? Social capital? So it much depends on what you're expecting and looking for. I don't think in general a culture will produce the kind of things you're talking about in the same way that what I'm calling traditional religion, denominational with very defined traditions and Catholic social teaching and mainline Protestant. I don't think it's going to be like that at all. But I still think it's kind of forming around the possibilities. I think that it has the potential on some parts of its spectrum but I think its impact on society will be more for what it's not and its deep cultural transformations of its vision of what life is all about, what the cosmos is, what living a good life looks like, what you should be doing with your time. I think that's the longer term, deep cultural consequences. And I don't see a lot of that as being pro-social. If what you mean by pro-social is people get a worldview where they understand what they believe is going on, they know their place in it, they have some relationships, they have a local community, then yeah, people get a lot of that out of it. They're not just meaningless, floating around nihilists, don't know anything. It provides that, but I don't think that's what you're talking about. Yeah, I think there's a lot more work needs to be done about voting and whatever. But as I said 10 minutes ago, I do think the underlying, what this mirrors back to us, if what I'm saying about culture is true, what it mirrors back to us as a society is despair about the public collective action and the public good, which is completely understandable. I mean, how long have we had Washington gridlock? How toxic is, this is a rational response for a lot of people to the world we live in.
I think it's gardening. It counts for something. So per your presentation earlier this morning, and you had a point about and forgive me, my notes are over there from this morning, but you had a point about spirituality and affiliation, and you used that word in there somewhere along the way. And I thought, and the way you answered the question, you were essentially saying no. And per Brian Steensland, so Brian and I we've talked a lot over the last few months working on a research project, and Brian is a professor at the University of Indiana at Indianapolis. He's a well-known scholar who's the lead author of a RelTrad, which is, anyway, it's a nerdy thing that we love in sociology. And we use it when we analyze surveys. And we're in the process of revising RelTrad. And Brian does not believe that spiritual should be any way a part of our revised RelTrad. And I agree with him. But at the same time, if you look in the General Social Survey, for example, the percentage of African Americans who said that they are spiritual but not religious has increased dramatically. There are more black folks that are SBNRs now than there are black folks that are Methodists, than there are black folks that are Pentecostal, there are black folks that are Catholic, not all combined, but generally. That means something, right? That does mean something. People are clearly rejecting organized religion, and they're saying that there's something in their lives that they believe something. That being said, they don't have any community engagement, right? They're not involved in any meaningful way in the community. My guess is if we were to run RelTrad and include a variable for spiritual but not religious, in the broader American public, there'd be a great number of Americans that would say that they are, maybe as much as 10%. It might be larger than mainliners, but there's no engagement with it. So I don't know what it tells us besides that people like to get out and go garden, right? Oh, I believe in something, but it doesn't have any real consequences for engagement and community and moving forward in society. So that's where I just don't think it holds much water. And then what do the children of those SBNRs believe in the future? I don't think that they hold SBNR as they grow up, or if they think that it means anything.
Well, part of what I'm saying in the book, though, it's not just a culture or spiritual. Even just the millennial zeitgeist itself is already a sort of a despair about collective political. It's already, the whole zeitgeist is sort of, yeah, I mean, like we interviewed 209 and post-boomers around this, and it's very much like, yeah, I don't have many friends. I'm friends with some people at work. I wish I had more community, but I don't know how to do that. And some vote, some don't, but I think there's a repeated disappointment. We've talked about this over meals. Like, for a lot of people, the Obama era was a source of hope, and then that was disappointing. Sort of like, now we're really in trouble. Like, so again, it's a turning inward to, well, I'll take care of my life. I'll have whatever friends I can manage and my family, lower my expectations for the American dream, try to get by, be happy enough.
That sounds a lot like gardening.
Yeah, but then the next question is, if you get lots and lots and lots of people gardening and starting to exchange and whatever, like what emerges out of that? That's what I would say. It's not just all isolated. There's a network connection of all this.
Matt Brown, AP.
Thank you guys for doing this. This has been a very, very thought-provoking conversation. And I just want to initially say as well that I am in love with the covers of both of your books. Very well designed and very, very, very great graphic design. I have many questions, but I want to limit it to just one for just my analytical understanding. You have a truly Christian, profound hodgepodge of different forces that are both leading up to this zeitgeist and that are then included in the phenomena that come out of it. So I'm curious for your perspective on, do you view Christianity as a zeitgeist in itself or as a phenomenon, maybe a uniquely powerful phenomenon that flourished under previous zeitgeists?
I think the latter, if I understand you correctly.
Okay, so
Yeah. I mean, it's a deeply embedded historical tradition with multiple dimensions to it in our social order, and it exerts a lot of influence in the shaping of human life. Yeah, the way I mean zeitgeist, it wouldn't apply to Christianity. Zeitgeist is a much broader societal level. In a way, a zeitgeist is sort of a spirit of a sacred canopy, to go back to a Bergerian theory. It's overarching. So in the zeitgeist, you can be Jewish or Mormon or whatever. You're still in that, swimming under that, in that ocean, so to speak. I don't know if that really answers your...
No, it does. And then I'm just a follow-up question on that. I'm interested in why you would define it as a zeitgeist that would overturn such a deeply embedded 2,000-year-old force in society, that like a 20-year period would upend.
The 20-year period is when it's sort of, when the tipping points happened, or when the avalanche finally, like an avalanche, it gets set up by lots and lots of physical forces. And then all it takes is a skier to come by and bang their knee and the whole thing goes down. And then the other part of an image of an avalanche is it starts a little bit at the top, and then through entrainment, it picks people up. So people that never would have said, I'm not religious, they hear other people saying, I'm not religious, and they're like, oh, I can say that now. And so it picks people up and starts to accumulate more and more and bigger until it sort of reaches a plateau point at the bottom of a recent landscape study. I don't know, but yeah, so I guess it goes back. There are lots of long-term forces that lead up to this. Things happened right at the beginning, in 1991, I think, that were like triggers. That's an oversimplification, I recognize, but I think that's how it worked.
Okay, absolutely. And then one more like follow-up on that someone pulls in, the question of the contemporary Black church is, do you view the multiplicity of beliefs that sometimes people can have? We talked about how people can be, still attending church, but then also believe in like healing crystals and whatnot. How new is that phenomenon? Because just anecdotally in my life as like a Southern Black person, there were definitely people who were going to the church, but then also like, doing some Gullah Geechee, like, some multiplicity of different faiths.
I think it's always been out there. Mm-hmm. I think it's just become more publicly acceptable and less recognized as like, I know this doesn't fit together, that I believe in astrology and the resurrection, but nevertheless, I think it's just more normal. And I think that's part of a background picture has changed, to oversimplify, in a sort of a pop postmodernist culture where, why are we expecting coherence and everything to add up and everything to make sense? Like, that's a whole world it's a crazy world. Like, that's authoritarian, totalitarian world. So it's fine. People can put together whatever they want to put together. It's normal. So I'm not saying it's a new thing. I think that's always been there. Yeah. But I think it's become probably more acceptable and more common.
I agree with that fully. A lot of, is it the Pew Report? Many Americans mix multiple faiths from years ago? Yeah. I remember reading that years ago and thinking about long ago a grandmother of mine who's long since gone, and how she was every Sunday at church, but also believed in her lucky numbers. And so I just kind of thought like that's a real contradiction, Grandma, but it worked for her and it worked for so many others. And so I think that you're exactly right, that it comes out now in a way that it's acceptable. But I think back in the day, Grandma wouldn't have told anybody about her lucky numbers outside of her family. But I think that these are common themes that are much more acceptable in today's world.
This is true of like paranormal thing. Lots of people have weird, like inexplicable life experiences. Michael Shermer, Barbara Ehrenreich. I mean, these people have seen, like, you can't explain that. But what they say is, I kept this quiet for 30 years because I knew people would think I was crazy, but I'm finally just going to tell the world. So I think the world is such that now you can say, my grandmother visited me from the dead. Mm-hmm. Or I had this completely wild, transcendent experience. I can't even begin to describe it to you. It's just more okay to say that because of the spread of a culture, I would say.
And, sorry, one final question just on the...
Wait a minute, that's the same as Mark Shop.
Just on the question of a culture, in your view, do these things, you described UFOs, the paranormal, karma, chakras, alternative medicine, reincarnation, herbalism, vampires, crystals, pagan, do all of these things move together? Like, does someone who believes in vampires also so then what is the
there's an underlying sort of loose coherence that holds much of it together, but a lot of it is spinning out here and there. And then there are subcultures within that subculture. So people in the vampire underground may not be into like body energies and chakras, but underneath of it, there's this common sense of the world is not what it appears to be on the empirical surface. What the established institutions have told us about reality is not all there is. There's a lot more. Maybe you've been deceived about it by science and the government and whatever. And what we need to do now is to get in touch with probably ancient knowledge, gnosis, about things that have been suppressed both by religious actors and secular actors. Here's the occult people into a culture view themselves, I think objectively, have had two people suppressing them that aren't friendly to each other. But the traditional religion suppresses a culture for its own reasons, and the secular metaphysical naturalism suppresses it for its own interest. And so there's this sense of like, we're not being paid attention to. So where am I? So what I'm saying is, there's an underlying, Colin Campbell, a British cultural sociologist, says it's the Easternization of the West. The ultimate piece of it is going from a Western dualism to an Eastern monism. To me, that's a little oversimplified, but there's something to that. If you dig down into much of this, not all of it, but much of this, all of reality is ultimately one. Where your destiny is ultimately one. They may not use the word Brahman or whatever, but there's the divine. You have a spark of the divine in you. And once you realize that, then you can change your life, and then you will be reunited to the divine, either in this life or after you die. So again, it's this deep cultural categories that most of us sitting around here will be like, what? But people are really buying into. So again, it's a promissory note. I promise I'm going to show that there's an underlying coherence to this, even if it's not organized in the same way that the United Methodist Church is.
Well, it feels just like this room. You know, Alan publishes a 397-page Pew landscape survey, and people are like, when's the next one coming out?
Exactly.
Yeah.
394 pages.
All right. And Chris Smith publishes a 419-page book, and it's like, well, come on, what the promissory note? You guys have done both an incredible thing in these publications. We're really grateful for the window. I got a couple quick announcements, and then we'll take a break. So,
I have to give the apology.
Oh, please, let's start with that.
Okay, so huge mea culpa. An apology. Very embarrassing. It was not Dan Aykroyd, it was Chevy Chase. Dan Aykroyd was the one who ate the dessert topping. It's the godly voice is Chevy Chase. I misspoke. Do not let this go into the record uncorrected. My life will be miserable.
I'm paying attention. Thanks for that. Tomorrow morning we will pivot from, data and the why to what clerics are up to, what clerics are feeling from all this.
Based on data.
How they're navigating all this based on data. Mark Chaves has been part of the team that did this large study of national religious leaders, so we're looking forward to hearing about that, and Yonat's going to respond to that and get into it a little bit. Just very quickly, you can think tomorrow morning about checkout like gardening, or you can think about checkout more like a pro-social, societal blessing to your fellow journalists, all right? If you're in the latter camp, you'll get up early and check out before breakfast. And just bring your bag in here, it's no big deal. And that way, when the break happens at 10:30, and there's just a little bit of time at the line, Other people would be able to go nice and easy. Okay, so we'll find out whether you think of checkout, like a pro-social contribution, or whether you just want to be a selfish gardener.
Gardening is not selfish. It's one
right.
of the highest activities you could engage in life.
You see in your agenda that you have, with dinner tonight, we have in the pool terrace, which basically means if you walk through the front door of the hotel and just keep going straight, you kind of bend, to the left and to the right. It's right back there by the pool, but above the pool, closer to the hotel than the pool. And that's where we'll have cocktails at 6 o'clock and dinner at 7 o'clock. So looking forward to that. I think that's all we've got. Yeah. So enjoy the place. We'll see you at 6 o'clock for cocktails. Thank you guys both very much. Yes, you have it.